The existence of transnational ideological projects such as USAID or the Global Green Initiative or the European Union's Green Deal or ILGA or so many others of such nature has had an even higher negative effect on the global south than it had on the collective West, since we're using the terminology from the enemy propaganda, I guess. And this effect is even more visible in the global south than it is here. And the best way to evaluate that is to read the propaganda. In the first 6 episodes, we read propaganda from as well as previous season. We read propaganda from Southeast Asia. Now we're moving into Latin America. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome once again to the Freedom Alternative, to the Propaganda Basement. We can continue with the season 5 and got a new pile of newspapers after we wrapped up the ones from Lao, and these ones will be for most of the rest of the seasons, and then at the end of the season I have a very pleasant surprise for you all. It should be fun. Right, so let's go straight into it because there's a lot to discuss. Please notice the format of the newspaper, very serious. The kind of format that used to be fashionable in the West as well, but well, not anymore, as more and more newspapers either straight up turned into tabloids or at least their format turned into tabloids. This one is $1, as in $1. It's from Ecuador, and as you know, in Ecuador the official currency is the US dollar. So Friday, October 4th, 2024, El Universo. I tried really hard to find whether this particular paper has gotten USAID funds. I have found no evidence of that happening, but considering the content, I'm very much tempted to believe that I just haven't looked enough, quite frankly. I mean, this newspaper is bought more by the serious people, maybe I should say more educated people and whatnot. It's not considered a tabloid, even though a lot of it is pretty tabloidish, but that's a separate story. So, page 2, energy crisis. The shutting down of electricity will be reduced to 4 up to 5 hours per day starting from now until the end of the week. So the newspaper is from Friday, so for the next 2 days, next 3 days after this paper, the electricity blackouts will just be 4 up to 5 hours. Now, probably, of course, this requires a lot of explanation. During the time of a certain character, his name was Rafael Correa, brought into power largely by the US Democrat Party. It's quite funny. I was there when the Democrat Party officially disowned him by through the Biden administration issuing sanctions, personal sanctions against him. But anyway, 11 years prior, in 2013 or so, the Correist movement got a lot of money from the US to make itself big. And it did, and it won the election. And during the time of this particular left-wing administration, the infrastructure for oil and gas, because again, Ecuador has its own natural resources, was neglected. It was pretty much like a Venezuela style of situation, except it didn't require nationalizations and the country did not become that poor as Venezuela because again the regime was still democratically elected, even though very very left wing economically and socially. So the infrastructure was neglected, and it all worked out still pretty well because there was a time when the price of oil was still very high, which meant the even reduced production yielded decent profits, not just for the state company, but also for the cronies in the regime, because that's how these things work, generally speaking. But then, things happened. The pandemic project hit, which lowered the price of oil, and then the escalation by Russia in Ukraine, which also changed the oil market globally and negatively affecting inconsistent producers, let's put it this way, like Ecuador. And one thing led to another. There was also a long drought, which also reduced the production of electricity from hydro sources. All of these things combined, plus some other mismanagement, which is inherent in state companies, led to an energy crisis that, at least at the moment of this recording, is still not fully over, although it's significantly better than when this newspaper was printed. Led effectively to a state of emergency on the energy and intentional decoupling from electricity for several hours a day, every single day, especially in the large cities of Ecuador, particularly the capital city Quito and the economic capital Guayaquil, which of course I'm going to show you some footage from there rather than see my face, because it's quite unfortunate, especially Guayaquil. I'm still missing the place. If it weren't so violent, I would have seriously consider moving there. It's such a lovely place. The people there are very nice. But in any event, this is the context of Ecuador, in the context of this type of propaganda. And the reason I insist is because throughout the rest of the episode and the rest of the season, really, you'll see just how many utterly irrelevant topics are part of the mainstream conversation, or at least the pseudo mainstream conversation, while the vast majority of the population has to suffer through blackouts, through state-enforced blackouts, essentially, right? Here you go, page 4. The European Union is applying a law that applies extra taxes to products that cause deforestation. The norm will be applied to 7 products, among which is cacao, which is really, really interesting to keep in mind, because this is essentially a fuck up both of the European Union, that has negative consequences upon not just Ecuador but most of Latin America. So on one hand, we had European politicians trying really, really hard to get a trade deal, not necessarily a free trade deal, but definitely a trade deal with the so-called Mercosur group. And then immediately after they got it, the first thing they did was starting to apply EU-style regulations on products from the Mercosur group, which in practice meant that nothing could actually be imported from those areas, because the EU norms and regulations on these things were written by effectively crazy people, Green Party and things like that, United Nordic Green Left, all of that psychiatric facility, right? Written by people who are not just crazy or ideologically possessed, but basically people who understand absolutely nothing about industry in general and about how production works and all of that. I mean, they just really, really don't understand it. So there's that. So no, it's another situation of ideological colonialism, effectively, from the so-called first world. I have my doubts whether the European Union still constitutes as first world these days, onto the rest of the planet. So it's not an issue, and you will see throughout the newspapers from Ecuador that we'll be reading. It's not an issue that Ecuador, or generally speaking, most of Latin America, with the exception of, I suppose, of Cuba and Venezuela, it's not that they see themselves as the global South against the West or whatnot. It's more like that a lot of their industries are straight up the victims of ideological possession of the West. Anyway, solar energy could replace the electricity that is cut through intentional planning. Right, the cuts of electricity for up to 8 hours or more throughout the state of emergency could be replaced by systems of solar energy. Now, all of this entirety, this article and this school of thought, which was very aggressively pushed on TV around this time in October, November 2024, when I was there in Ecuador, the whole school of thought stank, I suppose. The local vloggers there were thinking like, who the hell pays for this thing? I mean, why is there such a... It was very much of a sudden appearance of such forms of ideological possession. A lot of it was chalked up to the fact that Colombia, neighboring Colombia, was hosting one of these COP29, 2030, whatever summits, climate summits and whatnot. And it was like, well, it's maybe just a spillover of green propaganda from there. And some of that was true. I mean, a lot of this green propaganda just like that stopped after the summit in neighboring Colombia, but some of it still lingered on for several more months afterwards, and some of it was around even before the summit. I mean, this one is printed before the summit, and it's that kind of thing that, you know, on one hand you can chalk it up to naivete, but on the other hand, in a country that already has mandatory blackouts as a result of shortages of electricity, and those shortages of electricity occurred because of a decade of green policy, because officially Mr. Rafael Correa did not just neglect the oil and gas infrastructure. It was an intentional ideological push. Fossil fuels are bad, all while his cronies were making very good money off of it, of course. Fossil fuels are bad. We're going to make the country energy independent by installing windmills and solar panels and whatnot. And sure, they did install quite a few of those, and in the process enriching the CCP, obviously. And of course, when push came to shove to use those, because there isn't enough oil and gas to keep the lights on, literally, well, fun fact, no, that didn't work out. So even in that context, you still had these kinds of things where they would shield solar panels as a solution to the problem created by the government to begin with, which is quite fascinating. And then to keep on with the context, so on one hand, hostility escalates in the country, explains the government, because of the existence of the state of emergency. Now, there was another state, there were essentially two concurrent state of emergencies in Ecuador. It was one, the one with energy, that allowed the government to just effectively disconnect people from electricity, depending on the area and highest consumption and whatnot. But then there was also another state of emergency on public security grounds. Why? Because, well, as time went on, a lot more and more of the cartels moved from Colombia to Ecuador, and with them came the violence, obviously. And then there were also some other situations, other contexts from which Ecuador fell on the wrong side of them. Such as, if you remember, during the last year of the Biden administration, the southern border of the United States was very much widely opened. And one way to bring in people into the U.S., especially people, because, especially in 2024, there were several questions, not just from right-wingers, but generally non-Democrats, right, non-leftists, were like, oh, okay, hold on a second. Okay, fine. There are some Mexicans and some Hondurians and some Ecuadorians and whatnot coming in illegally through the southern border. Okay, we at least can conceptualize on why and how this is happening. But hold on a second. Why are there so many Chinese citizens or Thai citizens coming in illegally through the southern border into the United States? Well, those actually started their so-called land route in Quito, in Ecuador. And from there, they would go slowly, sometimes walking, sometimes by bus and whatnot, slowly from country to country, all the way up to the northern part of Mexico and closer to the US border. That people trade was primarily operated by a Chinese cartel. And of course, once it became clear that it's a very profitable trade, other cartels in the region, such as the Mexican cartels or the local Ecuadorian ones or the Colombian cartels or the Albanian mafia, which is also heavily present in Latin America, particularly Colombia and Ecuador, they wanted a piece of that trade as well, the people trade effectively. And one of the reasons they really wanted that is because they had lost a lot of money. Why did they lose a lot of money? Well, because the Chinese did not just come with a recipe to transport people in exchange for illicit profits, but they also came with what the Chinese mafia usually comes, which is fentanyl. And the fentanyl crisis hit differently in Latin America. It didn't hit like in the US with very large addiction and whatnot. That happened too, but not to the extent that it happened in the United States. But instead disrupted the entirety of the local drug market because fentanyl is significantly cheaper, and thus dried up the profits of the cartels. And once that happened, now of course those kinds of institutions, the cartels, are not just gonna lay down peacefully and just, oh well, I guess the grift is over. No, no, no. They're gonna regroup, and they're gonna try to get something else, such as a share of the people trade, or to make money from something else like protection taxes. And that's all of these situations simultaneously happening upon Ecuador led to a very sharp increase in public violence and a very sharp decrease in the level of public security. How significant? Well, this paper explains it in a title that is quite terrifying to read. Homicide, the main cause of death for minors between the ages of 5 and 17, says the Institute of National Ecuadorian Statistics, whatever. The new data was published by this organism, the INEC. It's for the general death data for 2023, and it revealed that violence has increased significantly and is now among the main reasons of death. And it's one of those situations where public security, you realize just how important public security is, because here you go, they put the tables here. So changes, so data for 2023 compared to 2022, right? So this is heart disease, right? Well, ischemic, I don't know how it's called in English, right? Really, I know how it's called in Romanian. So, no, but generally, heart disease, a drop by 2.4%, which is quite amazing, actually, given that heart disease is usually the main problem, the main cause of death in most countries in the world, right? Brain accidents, neurological disorders minus 7.6%, again a decrease. Diabetes, again a significant drop. Auto accidents, an increase by 7.9%, which is understandable in a country that only now is rich enough that more and more people are buying cars and whatnot. So it's not, and if you've seen the roads in Ecuador, you kind of do understand why this happened, right? Pneumonia and influenza, again a drop, a significant drop. Blood pressure disease and associated diseases, again a significant drop. Right, diseases of the urinary tract, a significant drop. In almost everything that matters is a significant drop. But then aggressions, and by that they mean homicides, 59.5%. Now for 2024, the data looks even worse than this. So even though the general, you would say, public health of the populace is in fact improving in ways that would have been deemed amazing 10 or 15 years ago, but because of the public security situation, everything is just forgotten. Even though in absolute number of deaths, the increase is not as significant. I mean, all of these other drops are definitely offset this increase, but not just the populace, but also the elite, correctly, I will say, perceives that this is so bad that it requires extraordinary measures. It's far worse than if there had been an increase in heart diseases and deaths from heart diseases, even though the absolute number of deaths would have been higher, nobody perceives it as a very much of a big deal. But because it's an increase of deaths as a result of aggression and crime, it is perceived as far worse, even though, again, in absolute numbers, things are nowhere near that bad. If you look at it. And again, I'm not faulting the Ecuadorian elite or this newspaper or really for thinking like that, because this is pretty much normal. Why? Because crime is ultimately the victims can be pretty random. This is especially true in Ecuador, because you can find yourself in the crossfire between the struggles of two rival gangs. I mean, this happened a few meters away from me while I was taping in a certain central, actually, neighborhood area of Guayaquil. So this can be pretty random. You can get yourself into trouble either through injury or straight up death as a result of just being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Whereas heart disease definitely does have a at least a percentage of choice, right? While of course there are situations of individuals who develop heart diseases as a result of bad luck, genetics, and whatnot, a lot of it still has its origins in the individual's chosen lifestyle. So as a result, it is perceived societally as less bad than crime. So there's that. And there you go. There's also some examples, right? Here's a man was assassinated in the neighborhood Carmen, and the police, well, ended the anti-socialists, the anti-socials, right? The criminals. It's a lot of it is dedicated to crime, of course, because, well, unfortunately, that was an issue. Then there's the at that moment considered the center of the crime, right? This place, Duran, and maybe instead of showing you the newspaper, maybe I should show you footage from there, because even though I was strongly advised by both the police and the one of the friends of the sofa, I was strongly advised not to go here and videotape here. Now, of course, I still did go, because otherwise, why go to Ecuador in the first place if and do with an attempt to do a series from there, if not to go to the complete and most dangerous place and explain why it has become dangerous. And again, because it hit the nice places, I mean, this place, Duran, that you're looking at, used to be a tourist hotspot. So it was a revenue generating area for the region, for this part of Ecuador, and that's where the cartels set up shop, and not just one, but several, and now they're fighting for dominance over it. And because it is connected by this beautiful cable car from the rest of the city, that means it has the logistics already set up, so you can produce the drugs here in Duran and then easily distribute them into all of the other places without too much of a fuss. Of course, that creates a huge problem from a public safety perspective, but it also made the place now deserted. I mean, you can see these facilities that used to bristle with tourists just a few years ago. Now they're, as you can see, pretty much abandoned, and it's a terrible wound. Not just economically, although the economic wound is, of course, the biggest problem for the locals, but it's also a social wound as well, because they used to be very proud of this area, and for good reason. Meanwhile, a few days earlier, so this one is from the previous week, right, September 27th, 2024. Notice this is more of a tabloid format, Super Ecuador. This newspaper actually has more readers than the serious one that I've just shown you earlier. It's good to know this one because at the same time as the public security disaster was occurring, or all of that increasing crime rate was happening. Then there was also these forest fires that were intentionally started by various individuals. It's really quite interesting because, on one hand, there is the instinct of most of these newspapers in Ecuador to go with the climate change narrative. Uh, Although they want to do that, they also have to also say that, look, well, actually, there was a this was kind of intentional and these things happened. So no, it's a very interesting mixture between propaganda and facts. It's a much better propaganda, really, than what you can see in Western newspapers, who are either full propaganda or full autistics, um, just the facts only. But this one is a little bit more mixed. Like, for instance, this one, right? The secret to living all the way to the age 102. And so you have um, a mixture of propaganda and facts just so you can keep the audience. It's a very effective format. We used to have these kinds of things as well, but for some reason they became passe in the West because potato, effectively. So there's that. Okay, so since I mentioned that there is a state of emergency on public safety, uh, maybe I should get a little bit more into the details. So Super Ecuador, Monday, September the 23rd of 2024. That's interesting. It doesn't have the year here, but it is 2024. Trust me on that. She had an arsenal. There you go. Of a 34-year-old woman was also detained during the raid or intervention. A total of 30,000 munitions of various calibers, firearms, and drugs have been confiscated in two places in the Cuba borough at the south of Guayaquil. The operative named Renasser 27 was in charge of the operation. The agents of the national police went there and got 30,000 ammunitions, 602 generators, 15 grenades, hand grenades, eight detonators, a lot of dynamite, a huge arsenal. Now, why does this matter? Because on one hand, owning some of these things is actually legal, or at least somewhat permitted, either de facto or sometimes even de jure in Ecuador. One of the reasons is because the police and the military police, or the militarized police, I mean, they've reorganized their law enforcement several times since the start of the struggle against the cartels. They are still underarmed and underfunded. The reason being that it's a historical one. Historically, the army used to do, well, coup d'etat in the country, and one of the conditions to return to democracy was that the army gets well funded, and of course that was heavily observed, but oftentimes that happened to the detriment of the police, which is supposed to maintain order. Now, that wasn't a huge problem as long as most of the crime was low, petty, neighborhood type of crime. But then once more professional cartels showed up in the country, that became a problem, because suddenly now you had to work against folks who know exactly what they're doing in terms of violence. So once that happened, it became a problem. And unfortunately, and this was confirmed to me by two police officers in two entirely different areas, there have been cases multiple times where police officers had to buy bullets from their wages from the open market, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally. So as a result, one way to patch this shortage until the government is able to provide, and it has been quite a problem for the government to provide this, is precisely to ramp up these raids and confiscate some ammunition straight up from the cartels on on gun charges based on these kinds of things. Well, you don't have the proper paperwork, you don't have a license for this particular type of bullets and that particular type of bullets. Of course, this is politically incorrect to say, especially in Ecuador, but if you look closer to the kind of ammunition that they routinely find and confiscate in these raids, it's routinely the case that they kind of fit exactly the kind of ammunition that the police itself needs, and it's rarely the case that they confiscate something bigger or something from that is fit for the kind of weaponry that the police doesn't have. Now, I'm not saying that, well, actually, no, I am saying that they're doing selective enforcement just so they can keep up with the cartels in the general mission that now all law enforcement officers have in Ecuador, which is to increase the level of public safety to the extent that it is possible. Now, of course, none of this was made better in the subsequent months after these newspapers were printed and after I left Ecuador. None of this was made better because of the or through the political shenanigans that occurred in the country. But more on that in the following episodes once we get to the proper newspaper that talks about that and give you some context. So yeah, with that said, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you like this kind of content, please do consider becoming a member. See you on members.freedomalternative.com, because none of this is possible without your financial support. So with all that being said, thank you all for watching. I'll see you all soon. Cheers.